in the case of the Kremlin, a part of their hybrid war has been political murder, mainly directed against their own people. Now, how did Vladimir Putin emerge to become so powerful that he could do away with his fiercest critics at will? And why should we in the West care about Putin's political murders? And what can we do about it? Now, Mr. Putin was an unknown figure when Boris Yeltsin appointed him prime minister in August 1999. And this is a quote which I find very apt. Under normal circumstances, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin might today be a track-suited personal security guard for one of the many oligarchs who in fact live and breathe and luxuriate at his pleasure. Short, bald, with an almost reptilian gait, the former KGB case officer never seemed destined for anything other than a bit player in the never-ending Russian tragedy. But Mr. Putin was in the right place at the right time. You probably, most of you know Putin's background. He was born in Leningrad in 1975 and became a rank-and-file KGB officer, eventually posted to East Germany. And then after 1991, he worked in the St. Petersburg mayor's office, where he enriched himself through lucrative government contracts. And he also formed ties with the Russian mafia. In 1996, he moved to Moscow to work in the Kremlin. And in 1998, he was appointed by Yeltsin to be head of the FSB, the successor to the KGB. Then prime minister in August 1999. Why? Why did Yeltsin choose Putin? Well, as FSB chief, Putin had all the files on corruption by Yeltsin and his family and his close circle. So this was a Faustian bargain between Yeltsin, the Yeltsin group and Mr. Putin. As we know, Putin gained quite a bit of popularity because of the September 1999 apartment bombings in Russia, which were blamed on Chechen terrorists. Supported by the oligarchs who owned most of the media, Putin won easily in the March 2000 presidential elections. It took a while, however, before people understood that Mr. Putin was the complete antithesis of a Democrat. Gradually, he rolled back on democratic reforms introduced in the Yeltsin years and began clamping down on the independent media. Significantly, he installed his cronies from St. Petersburg, mainly from the KGB, into key positions in the Kremlin, the so-called Siloviki. And these Putin allies controlled the security services and the criminal investigation agencies, as they still do today. This meant that, well, key Putin critics and political opponents were eliminated. When key opponents were eliminated by murder, Putin's men would control the investigation. Now, I'm only going to discuss 4 cases today. I would say are the most prominent cases of political murder under the Putin regime. They are as follows. Award-winning journalist Anna Politkovskaya was gunned down in the stairwell of her Moscow apartment building in October 2006. Former FSB officer Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned by polonium-210 in the UK a month later. Democratic politician Boris Nemtsov shot to death on a bridge just outside Kremlin walls in February 2015. And then most recently, former GRU, that is military intelligence officer Sergei Skripal, was poisoned along with his daughter Yulia in March 2018 in Salisbury. These Russian victims had several things in common. The first was that they had all made themselves personal enemies of Putin. This is Anna Politkovskaya. As a reporter for Novaya Gazeta, she traveled more than 50 times to Chechnya, documenting the war there and the atrocities committed by the Russian military during the Second Chechen War, which Putin launched in 1999. She wrote in scathing terms about Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov and about Putin himself. This is just one example. Why do I dislike Putin, Politkovskaya wrote. This is precisely why. I dislike him for a matter-of-factness worse than thievery, for his cynicism, for his racism, for his lies, for the massacre of innocents that went on throughout his first term. It was Politkovskaya who coined the phrase, the Kremlin's Chechen dragon, to describe Kadyrov, with whom she had a terrifying encounter in the summer of 2004. Now, Kadyrov is an important figure in my discussion. He has for years been Putin's man in Chechnya, as you know. He's a brutal, ruthless thug who rules Chechnya with an iron fist. Putin keeps Kadyrov in power because he depends on Kadyrov to keep restive anti-Russian Chechens from fomenting unrest. Kadyrov has also used his men to eliminate both his and Putin's political opponents. Now, Alexander Litvinenko also made himself an opponent of Mr. Putin. In November 1999, while still an FSB officer, Litvinenko gave a scandalous television press conference announcing that the FSB had asked him and his colleagues to kill Russian oligarch Boris Berezovsky. Litvinenko was later called to meet with Putin, then FSB chief, face to face. The meeting did not go well. Litvinenko was imprisoned and later in 2000 fled Russia for the United Kingdom. There he became a fierce and relentless critic of the Kremlin. He was financed and urged on mainly by Boris Berezovsky, who also sought asylum in the UK. Litvinenko was very critical of Putin and published quite a bit, exposing corruption and many other things. He also did consulting for MI6. And in the eyes of the Kremlin, Litvinenko was a traitor of the worst kind. In particular, I should quote something that he wrote in the summer of 2006, I should mention that he accused Putin of being a pedophile in one of his writings in the summer of 2006. A Russian colleague of mine, Alex Goldfarb, observed this, quote, I would think that if you say Mr. Putin is a pedophile, it would make Mr. Putin mad, regardless of the fact whether he is a pedophile or not. Now, Boris Nemtsov, another fierce Putin critic, was not only a leading member of the democratic opposition movement, who organized the 2011-2012 protest movements against the Kremlin. He also published a series of doklady, or reports, about Mr. Putin with different co-authors, documenting the extensive corruption of Putin and his cronies. The first was written in 2008, the first report, called Putin, the Results. Then he wrote another report about the fraud surrounding the Olympics in Sochi. And just before he was killed, Nemtsov was about to publish a report called Putin, the War, about Russia's military aggression in Ukraine. Perhaps more than anything else, what angered Putin was that Nemtsov was a vocal supporter of Western sanctions against Russia. And he traveled to Washington and elsewhere to lobby in favor of such laws as the Magnitsky Act. In the eyes of the Kremlin, this was highly treasonous activity. Now, Sergei Skripal. Putin probably did not ever meet Skripal, who was poisoned with a substance called Novichok in Salisbury, in the United Kingdom, along with his daughter Yulia, in March of 2018. But Skripal was indeed a traitor in Russian eyes. He had been working secretly for British MI6 and was admitted to have given names of dozens of GRU agents to MI6 and other Western intelligence agencies. He was arrested in 2004 and sent to prison, convicted of treason and sent to prison. But even though he was convicted of high treason, there's no death penalty now in Russia. So he was meant to languish there for many years. In 2010, he was exchanged in a spy swap and started a new life in Britain. Now, another thing that the four victims that I mentioned had in common was that they knew that they were on the Kremlin's hit list, and they had all received warnings. Politkovskaya received death threats in 2001 and fled briefly to Vienna. In fact, she was poisoned in September 2004 when she was on her way down to Beslan in South Ossetia to act as a negotiator with Islamic radicals who were holding hostages at the school there. You're all familiar with the really terrible hostage crisis. Politkovskaya never made it to Beslan. She ended up in the hospital because she was poisoned from drinking tea on the plane on the way down there. Presciently, Politkovskaya said in a 2006 video, "Why am I still alive? If I speak seriously about this, I would understand it's a miracle." Now, Litvinenko, who knew Politkovskaya personally, cautioned her the last time she visited London shortly before her murder that she was in danger, and he advised her not to return to Russia. But she insisted that she had a mission to report on human rights violations in her country, and she was not going to give up that mission for her safety. Alexander Litvinenko also had forewarning of his killing. After Politkovskaya's murder, he told a British consultant for whom he was doing contract work that he would be next. According to the consultant, quote, he worried about himself that there might be a list or that he would be on it. Now, interestingly, Litvinenko's photo was actually used as a target for the firing range of MVD, Ministry of Internal Affairs, internal troops. This was from documentation that was produced at the Litvinenko inquiry. On the very day of Litvinenko's poisoning, November 1st, 2006, Litvinenko received a direct warning from Mario Scaramella, an Italian associate with whom Litvinenko was working to expose Russian organized crime. He was warned by Scaramella that both his and oligarch Boris Berezovsky's names were on a list of those to be killed by the Russian security services. As you know, Berezovsky was later found hanging in his home outside London in 2013. Although initially Berezovsky's death was thought to be a suicide, many now think that he possibly was murdered, and the coroner finally left the verdict open. Boris Nemtsov, this is a picture of Ramzan Kadyrov. Boris Nemtsov also had warnings. And I found something interesting from Nemtsov's autobiography, that as far back as 2002, Ramzan Kadyrov, who likely participated in organizing the Nemtsov murder, threatened Nemtsov after Nemtsov spoke out at a gathering in Chechnya against the idea of a strong Chechen presidency. I can't say that I was frightened, Nemtsov said, because the Chechens who were around Kadyrov started to say that he was just joking when he threatened Nemtsov. But in his eyes, I saw that it was no joke. In his eyes, I saw hatred. This was what Nemtsov wrote about an encounter with Kadyrov in 2002. Not long before he was killed, Nemtsov observed in an interview that his mother was very worried that Putin would kill him. When asked if he shared her concerns, he said, "You know, yes, a little, not as much as mother, but still." According to journalist Yevgenia Albats, quote, "He was afraid of being killed and he was trying to convince himself and me that they wouldn't touch him because he had been a member of the Russian government and they wouldn't want to create a precedent." As for Skripal, Putin himself said when Skripal was released from prison as part of this spy swap that I mentioned, Putin said, "Traitors always come to a bad end." More recently, he referred to Skripal as a scumbag and a traitor to the motherland. So there is no doubt that all four of these victims knew and would have known that they were possible targets of the Kremlin. Now, what about the criminal investigations of their murders? In the cases of Politkovskaya and Nemtsov, both who were killed in Russia, the investigations followed a very similar pattern. Suspects were rounded up and charged quickly, but they failed to identify the zakazchiki, the masterminds. This is because, to state the obvious, Putin controls the investigative organs, the Procuracy, the FSB, and the Investigative Committee. After Politkovskaya was killed, 5 Chechen men were eventually arrested and found guilty. But there was no motive aside from money. Prosecutors claimed unconvincingly that the killers were indignant over her writings that were critical of the Kremlin, but this was a pretty lame excuse. The person who ordered the crime was not identified. Anna's son, Ilya Politkovskaya, said in 2016 that he learned from a high-level source that members of the Kremlin elite knew who had ordered his mother's murder, but were withholding the information. In the Nemtsov case, 5 Chechen men were sentenced in October 2017 to 10 to 20 years in prison for the killing. This includes Zair Dadayev, who was accused of pulling the trigger. But again, there was no apparent motive except for money, and those who organized and ordered the killing have not been charged. In the case of Nemtsov, the trail leads directly to Kadyrov, although some people would dispute this, but in my opinion and others. But of course, Kadyrov would never carry out such a crime without orders from Putin himself. The suspected organizer, Ruslan Geremeyev, a relative of several high-ranking Chechen officials, is still at large and believed to be in Chechnya, protected by Kadyrov. The killers used his car to carry out the murder and lived for several months in an apartment that he rented in Moscow. Geremeyev was deputy commanding officer of the Sever regiment, where Dadayev, the triggerman, served. This regiment is now part of the Russian National Guard, which is headed by Viktor Zolotov, Kadyrov's friend and patron, and a longtime Putin ally. Ruslan Mukhudinov, another member of the Sever regiment, allegedly promised money to the killers. He's on the Interpol list and reported to be in the United Arab Emirates. The trial itself of the killers of Nemtsov was a farce. The CCTV cameras belonging to the Federal Protective Service, which were on the bridge where Nemtsov was killed, this was a heavily guarded area, by the way, the footage was never produced. The authorities claimed that the cameras were facing on the Kremlin and not on the bridge. Important witnesses, such as Anna Dorotskaya, who was Nemtsov's female companion, as he walked along the bridge, were not called to testify, and other key evidence was excluded. Now, because Alexander Litvinenko was murdered on British soil, as you know, there was a proper investigation, although it took almost 9 years before the British High Court conducted an actual inquiry, thanks to the efforts of Litvinenko's wife, Marina Litvinenko. If things had gone according to the Kremlin's plan, the investigation and inquiry would not have happened. Alexander Litvinenko was supposed to die shortly after he was poisoned, and if that had happened, we never would have known that he had ingested polonium-210, a rare poison that is only produced in Russia under high security conditions. As Sir Robert Owen, the High Court judge, concluded after months of hearings, based on witness testimonies and a large amount of documentation, the poison was administered to Litvinenko at the Pine Bar of the Millennium Hotel on November 1st by Alexander Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun, who are pictured here, and they had been hired by the FSB. Both of them flew back to Moscow 2 days after the poisoning, and the Russian government refused to extradite them. Lugovoy, who had worked for Berezovsky and had been cultivating Litvinenko for several months, teamed up with him in efforts to get consulting jobs, was not suspected by Litvinenko. Litvinenko didn't seem to have any inkling that Lugovoy was planning to do harm to him. And neither actually did MI6, to whom Litvinenko, as I mentioned, was providing information. The motive of Lugovoy and Kovtun, Kovtun was enlisted late in the operation by Lugovoy, who was an old friend, was most probably money. But apparently they did not know how lethal the poison was that they brought with them to London. They inadvertently left polonium traces everywhere they went, and even contaminated themselves with polonium-210. Now, as with the Litvinenko case, the Skripal case also had special poison as the culprit, Novichok, which is produced in a Russian state laboratory, again under highly secure conditions. The two Russians carried out the attack with the help of a third, who was recently identified through the group Bellingcat, which one of our speakers talked about yesterday. This was another sloppy job. The two Russians were seen on cameras, CCTV cameras, during March 3rd and 4th, and Novichok was found in their hotel room. They also threw the poison in a perfume, put the poison in a perfume bottle and threw the bottle out, and it was later retrieved by two unsuspecting British people, and one of them died from the poison.
A mother of four. A mother of four.
A mother of four, yes. What's more, both of them were using, there they are here from one of the CCTV cameras, both of them were using false passports. Their real names were then discovered by Bellingcat, and all three of the culprits were GRU officers, identified as GRU officers. Two of them even received a Kremlin award in the past. So this is pretty much a smoking gun, and it links the crime directly to Putin because the GRU would not have orchestrated such a high-level international crime without the approval of Mr. Putin. Now, in his report on the Litvinenko case, Sir Robert Owen said that he was sure that Lugovoy and Kovtun had poisoned Litvinenko, but he was equivocal about Putin, saying only that the head of the FSB, Nikolai Patrushev, and Putin probably approved the killing. But these men, as with the Skripal case, would not have acted on their own initiative, and no one in the FSB would have ordered them to kill Litvinenko without Putin's approval. So the same could be said of both of these international cases. Just as Polikovskaya, Litvinenko, Nemtsov, and Skripal knew they were in danger of being killed, they also knew where the threat came from: Vladimir Putin. They understood the way things work in the Kremlin, that no one would dare kill people of their stature without orders from the top. So we can finally dismiss such talk as maybe someone did it to please Putin without him knowing beforehand. Or even worse, to follow the standard Kremlin line, the murder could not have been ordered by Putin because it was harmful to his stature as a leader. Putin, I think, is pleased to have people suspect that he ordered these murders, because they serve as warnings to other critics and intimidate them. Now, in the case of Litvinenko and Skripal, the attacks have damaged Putin's global image as a world leader, and they caused serious diplomatic problems as well. And also, as in the case of Skripal, economic sanctions. But at home in Russia, this is not such a bad thing. The actual fact that the Kremlin has been suspected of these murders, particularly in the case of Litvinenko and Skripal, both were traitors who, in the eyes of many people, deserved to be punished. Thank you. According to one Russian observer commenting about the Litvinenko murder, the view here is that Lugovoy and Kovtun are actually heroes. And this perhaps explains why Lugovoy was elected to the Duma and received a state honor from Mr. Putin. He also has become very wealthy. There is little doubt that Western government leaders know full well that Putin, often using Kadyrov, kills his critics both at home and abroad. But they do not always have a united response. In contrast to British leaders who pursued the Litvinenko case and would not have hesitated to blame the Kremlin for the Skripal poisoning, Washington has been less forceful. After President Bush asked Putin about the October 2006 killing of Polikovskaya in a telephone call just a few days after it occurred, he was apparently reassured by Putin's promise that there would be a thorough investigation. Of course, there never was. Despite the fact that only weeks later, Alexander Litvinenko announced on his deathbed that he had been poisoned by Putin, Bush welcomed Putin at his summer home in Kennebunkport, Maine, the following summer, so that the two could, quote, work on their personal relationship and enjoy a ride in Bush's speedboat. President Obama's response to the Nemtsov murder was also muted. Although he immediately condemned the crime and called upon the Russian government to conduct a thorough and impartial investigation, Obama did not follow up on a resolution which later died in the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations that was introduced by Senators John McCain and Lindsey Graham, urging him to seek a UN Security Council resolution that established an investigation, an independent investigation into the Nemtsov murder. So Obama did not follow up with this.
Oh, God.
As for Donald Trump, he has been, as you all know, dismissive regarding Russian President Vladimir Putin's sponsorship of political murders. He said famously in December of 2015, quote, "Nobody has proved that he's killed anyone. He's always denied it." This is what Trump said of Putin. And in October 2018, Trump, after being pressed into finally admitting that Putin was probably involved in political assassinations, Trump added a caveat: "It's not in our country." Trump's reactions, of course, are part of his consistent pattern of excusing the Kremlin's misdeeds. Trump seems to find in Putin a kindred spirit. He admires Putin for his toughness as a leader and for his apparent firm grip on power. And also, of course, he might defend Putin because the Kremlin has compromat on him that could be politically damaging. But Putin is no friend to the West, and it's hugely important that Western governments call him to account, not only for political murders abroad, but also those in his own country. Diplomatic and economic sanctions are valuable tools as a response to these acts. Even though the average Russian is unlikely to stop supporting Putin because of such murders, sanctions do have serious consequences for the Russian economy that ultimately have a negative effect on the Russian standard of living. Russians support their government with their pocketbooks in mind. The pension reform recently has, for example, damaged Putin's popularity. He signed last fall a pension law that was extremely unpopular, and it has resulted in quite a bit of discontent. Most ordinary Russians are deeply opposed to these reforms, and they sparked rare street protests across the country. In fact, a January 2019 survey found that public trust in Putin had fallen to its lowest since 2006. A little over 33% still trusted, of those polled, trusted Putin. While in 2015, his trust rating was at 71%. So economic circumstances really do affect how Russians view their president. Putin has been leader of Russia as prime minister or president for over 19 years. Maybe his rule and the violence he has committed against his own people will come to an end sooner than he expects. After all, is a leader really powerful when he has to kill his opponents in order to retain control over his regime?
Russia intelligence agencies, GRU, are one of the strongest such organization in the world. And these four murders looks like quite unprofessional. It looks like Russian ones that everyone knows that was Russian jobs, black jobs. Maybe it's because Russians want to show that it is cruel player not just inside the Russian Federation, but in the other side of the world too. What do you think?
Well, you're right. As I said, it was a very sloppy job, and there wasn't much effort on the part of the gentlemen who were involved, particularly the two that I pictured there, to hide their identity. Now that said, I think that the efforts of Bellingcat, and if any of you are interested, it's fascinating to read how they actually managed to identify these two GRU officers. It was a very painstaking process. So, I mean, in principle, perhaps the GRU thought that they even though the photos had been, the CCTV cameras had produced these images, that maybe that would be the end of it. And as you know, they went on television and said that they were just, salesmen, and they'd been visiting Salisbury Cathedral and so on. And, but I think, and also, as I mentioned in the case of Litvinenko, it was a very sloppy job. With polonium, someone said it was sprinkled all over London like Hansel and Gretel, with their little crumbles. It was again, mishandled. I don't think that this was purposeful, but I do think that in the end, it doesn't really do that much harm to the image of the Russian government, particularly domestically. And as I mentioned, when people wonder, well, what is Putin's purpose in ordering these murders? The purpose is to intimidate, and particularly with people like Skripal and Litvinenko, to deter others from possibly defecting. So I think that from the standpoint of the Kremlin, embarrassing and perhaps harmful to the image of Putin that these murders have been, they also have accomplished quite a bit of their general purpose.
Amy, thank you very much for a fascinating report on this most regrettable course that has been taken by President Putin's administration. My question is to your last remarks about Putin's popularity. What do you think, in the light of the events in Ekaterinburg, which has exposed, yet another spiral of corruption and greed on the part of the so-called benefactors of Russian Orthodox Church? What do you think this will contribute to any degree at all to Vladimir Putin's ratings? Will it have any effect on those?
Well, it's interesting. I'm constantly expecting more Russian indignation on the part of just ordinary Russians over the extent of the corruption. And for example, I know that, I can't remember the exact figures, but a lot of particularly younger Russians follow Alexei Navalny's Fund Against Corruption, and they see his exposés on YouTube and so forth. He gets quite a wide following, so it constantly surprises me that the actual corruption of the government does not concern Russians as much as it should. But as I mentioned, I think really when they and perhaps even this won't make a difference, but I think if anything is going to make a difference, it's when they continue to see this affect their standard of living, their buying power, their pocketbooks. Then it really does relate to them. For some reason, I think they can operate with the knowledge that people like Dmitry Peskov is wearing a $650,000 watch and Kremlin elite are driving in fancy cars and so on and so forth. For some reason, I think they almost accept this, but when they really begin to suffer, this is why we see the lowering of Mr. Putin's approval rating.
Thank you for your insights, and I just wonder, you most of the time during those cases talked about treason, but I wonder what are others, I would say, triggers which might might cause other or new cases on just. Do you think there would be some orders to act when it would be cases with image, I don't know, some interest or other cases? Just what might trigger the order of new political crime scenes? Thank you.
Well, you know, there have been other cases. I'll just cite Vladimir Murza, who was Nemtsov's close colleague, who's a democratic oppositionist. He's very active in publishing and speaking, and he actually lives partly in Washington, D.C., and goes back and forth, as far as I know, he still is, to Moscow. Murza has been poisoned twice, but in both cases almost died. So, and yet he continues to go about business as usual. He would be he is an example of someone else who is just targeted for expressing political opposition, for having close ties with the West. He's lobbied on Capitol Hill and so forth. So I think that that particularly Russian oppositionists who are connected with the West in any way is something that really arouses the Kremlin's ire. But you know, there have been other journalists within the country who haven't made a big point of going abroad and talking with Western politicians, who've also, they've been targeted in different ways. So, and in fact, I'm not sure about Politkovskaya. She certainly did speak abroad, but she didn't, it was mainly her personal writings. So I think it's probably a combination of personally arousing the ire of Mr. Putin, which would make you a possible victim, or some sort of connections with the West, and then also, of course, the real traitors, the people who worked for the Russian intelligence services, and then switch sides.
Thank you very much for an interesting talk. My question is, what are your scenarios about Russia after Putin? Because probably no autocrat can rule forever. So if you may interpret a little bit about what are the directions Russia may take in the future.
I really hesitate to speculate. I'm sure there are people here who are probably better qualified than myself, but I mean, ideally we would see a revival of free elections, such as those that occurred after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and some sort of a youth movement, people who don't get their news from the state-controlled Russian television. So ideally there would be a kind of a spontaneous arousal of political consciousness that would finally bring about some needed changes. I'm not necessarily talking about a real revolution, but something that would gradually force the people in the Kremlin to realize that they have to change. I think this would be the ideal, and I think that there is some ground for optimism. Now, one of the dangers, however, is that the Russian government has passed these laws that are clamping down on internet freedom, and if these laws are implemented, it could mean serious restrictions. And people like Alexei Navalny would not be able to, produce his wonderful documentaries and exposés, and also to encourage people to protest. But I would assume that, or hope that a younger generation, even the Kremlin-connected technocrats, those so-called reformers that for a while people had such great faith in, the people that we thought belonged to the Medvedev camp. Maybe such people really do exist in the lower levels of the Kremlin bureaucracy, and possibly there will be a gradual change. That's what I'm talking about the most hopeful future.
Any further questions? No? Okay, well, then thank you very much, Amy, for your presentation.